Shelia South, from the book, Singers by Peter Maguire. Read by Lucy Wharton. My funny Valentine. Sweet comic Valentine. You make me smile with my heart. Your looks are laughable, unphotographable. Yet you're my favorite work of art. Should there exist a contemporary Dr. Johnson, with a desire to recreate his famous dictionary, on reaching the letter F and needing to find a definition that encapsulated the word fastidious, he would need to look no further than Dr. Maurice Wilcock, Ph.D. It was a quality he evinced, almost, if not actually, the moment he emerged from the womb. This did of course delight his parents. His mother in particular. Nappies dispensed with far quicker than his peers. Mealtimes rarely left any inadvertent debris around either bowl, spoon, or his mouth. His mother would in later years insist that it had surely been his own decision to cease feeding at the breast and move rapidly on to the far more hygienic bottle. His father did from time to time have his own thoughts concerning his son's behavioral patterns, but in the world he lived in, his wife, and most of her acquaintances, could only express lavish praise for the enviable progress of this admirable paragon. His school days, and higher education, were ink-blot-free. Disillusioned teachers, whose only comfort was the lure of retirement, considered how much more fulfilling their careers would have been if only every child under their tutelage had been even fractionally similar to Maurice Wilcock Jr. Attentive, never skipping a lecture, essays delivered on time. Postgraduate thesis presented a solid if stolid ethical aspects of the Augustan poets. A lectureship was offered and accepted. The prospect in some time future, of a professorship, seemed certain. Now in his mid-40s this had yet to be achieved. Dr. Maurice Wilcock, Ph.D. did not care much for the modern world. Modern literature. Modern poets. The modern. Full stop. He progressed up the academic elevator, solidly, but without disruptive brilliance. Bright stars are admired in principle, but are in truth viewed with a certain self-preserving anxiety by some members of the teaching profession and academia, always keenly aware of the possibility of threat to their own opinions and carefully nurtured status. Being an intelligent individual, he had however realized at the start of his university career that academia is a game, and schism was something permissible only to the outstanding. However, Maurice lived his daily life in a cloud of quotations and metaphor. Could quote the moderns with admirable fluency. Was steeped, like a dried green pea, in the prose, poetry, and dramatic writings of the 20th century. Maurice was often called upon as a media pundit, though even when he was convincingly pontificating about Pound and Eliot. The greater portion of his mind and intellect continued to hover in and around the norms of the 17th and 18th centuries. Currently, he was attending, as a delegate, not a speaker, an academic conference hosted by the City University. The first day dripped and droned on by. Beckett, Joyce and the rest of the crew. He shuddered inwardly during the hour when a paper about Brecht was presented. He had been a delegate at such conferences many times before, sometimes as a contributor. Literary pathology labs, where reputational entrails were exposed and mulled over. At 8, drinks and canapés were served, and the buzz of jostling massed delegates moved up to ever greater levels of decibels. Maurice did not quite know how, even after the events that would follow, found himself in the midst of a small circle of younger delegates. Their interests were not really his interests, but unexpectedly enjoying the volley of conversation. Soon it was after 9 in the evening. Robert, who filled a teaching and minor research post at a rubric, without question, suggested, because they were all getting hungry, they might all go to have a meal in the town centre. Maurice would in general have preferred to say no. Nevertheless, he joined the party, and they called a taxi to take them to a Chinese restaurant someone had recommended. Maurice thought to himself that he would, when the meal had been eaten and paid for, he make his polite excuses about having to prepare for tomorrow's agenda, and return to his hotel. Somehow this did not happen. Dave greeted one member of the party with polite recognition. "Evening, sir. Good to see you again. No need to be members. You just sign them in." "No problem," pushing open the door. "Gentlemen." So it was, Maurice found himself, unexpectedly sitting, at a small table near the bandstand in the Chez. A round of drinks were ordered and Maurice sat, with some reservations, sipping a small dry sherry, fastidiously. Nightclubs were not only well beyond his comfort zone, it was an entertainment destination. Given a choice, he would have never considered choosing. The house lights, already dimmed even further, piano chords emanated from behind the now smoothly opening red velvet curtains. A presentable young man sang a song that appeared to hold the attention and meet the approval of the audience. Talk ceased and drinks more quietly imbibed. Another song, or two, followed. Then, following a stagey pause, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Chez is proud to present the wonderful Shelia South." Center stage, Shelia South, and hit the first beat of the 9th bar. Maurice sighed and took another taste of his dry sherry. What was he doing here? Later he did wonder if one or other of his companions had slipped something into his drink. The spotlight drew in his focus, with unfamiliar intensity, onto the young woman sitting on her high stool, singing a song with a lyric Maurice would never considered choosing or listening to, even if it had been the only surviving example of recorded music on a dying planet. South was, to use apt observation, a well-made young woman. Not slim. Not overweight. Proud contours she was unashamedly proud of. The silver lame dress, ankle length, enhanced her shape, shimmering artfully, sensually enhancing out each note and phrase. Maurice became perturbed and more than a trifle uncomfortable. The flesh on the inside of his sensibly under-panted thighs began to uncontrollably twitch and tighten. The more Maurice looked at the singer, the greater the reaction. He took a less constrained sip of his dry sherry. This surprising and unexpectedly pleasurable reaction, virus-like, continued and increased exponentially during South's 3-song set. It became apparent South had a fan base. Warm and appreciative applause ushered the red velvet curtains close. The house lights went up again. The gentle tingle in his loins subsided, except for an occasional, troubling, reflex twitch. Music from the trio continued. Later in evening pleasant enough songs were sung by a small dark-haired young woman called Tina North. Much later the evening concluded with what Maurice accessed to be a maudlin rendering of The Party's Over, his first hearing. It was in reality the closing song of every evening at the Chez. He amusedly catalogued it as the Americanized clone of Auld Lang Syne. Fastidiousness and a measure of conceit are often fellow travelers, and what he considered to be an original and apposite comparison was squirreled away, to be used as metaphor, during a tutorial sometime in the future. Maurice, in common with the habits of red-tailed rodents, found peace and security, knowing he had somewhere a store of nuts in reserve. It was 1 after midnight. The town hall clock rang out confirmation. A late hour for Maurice, who usually, with care and precision, slid his feet beneath the sheets and blankets around 10:30 most evenings. He had rooms in college, but generally lived and slept in the family home. Only his mother now. His father have passed on, several years ago, to a much less fastidious beyond. Pillow-hitting oblivion failed to manifest itself, and Maurice's wakefulness and unaccustomed pre-sleep discomfort began to create unfamiliar creases and bunching in the bed linen. Closing his eyes, a voluptuous, silver lame-draped vision hovered indeterminably between brain and eyelids. An unfamiliar, though not wholly disagreeable sensation, yet again, murmured from the inside of his thighs. The town hall clock marked out 3 after midnight, before the vision started to fade, and sleep at last released him. I'm not much to look at. Nothing to see. Just glad I'm living. And lucky to be. I've got a man crazy for me. He's funny that way. Sitting in a taxi, looking out at the illuminated shop windows displays, Maurice considered his life up until this unplanned journey, and its designated destination. Relations, other than aunts and uncles, had never occupied a meaningful sector in his daily life and work. Not a virgin, but the few encounters he had experienced as a university student he considered to have been messy, both before, after, and during the encounters. His experiments with flesh on flesh leaving him with a feeling of mild distaste. Maurice was content with who and what he was, and experienced no urge to seek out Plato the Symposium, a passage therein, set text first-year students, his missing other half. Now, at the age of 45, life was interesting and rewarding to an acceptable degree. The clasp of another's warm hand in the night, neither desired or missed. The taxi pulled up at the entrance to Back Cannon Street. "Can I drop you here, Gov?" Hard to turn the cab around. It's a narrow street. Maurice paid his fare, and the taxi moved off in search of other paying passengers. Pulling the collar of his overcoat up around his neck, he hesitated, just for an instant, and then walked down the dark and narrow way. Dave watched him get closer. "Good evening, sir. Nice to see you again so soon." "On your own?" Maurice parried with a short explanation. His companions of the previous evening having to be elsewhere. Dave nodded. Doormen follow a profession where discretion is sacrosanct. Pushing open the entrance door of the Chez, not a mention of membership, Maurice found himself shepherded to the same table he had previously occupied, and politely ordered a whiskey, somehow the intended request for a sherry, transmogrified in the saying. Ralph, he now knew his name, hearing it mentioned by the people sitting at another table, sang 3 songs, different than those of the previous evening. The red velvet curtains closed. Then, following on from Ralph's customary introduction, the house lights faded, the spotlight hit the mark, the curtains opened, Shelia South, sitting on a high stool, clothed in gold lame, hit the first note, this time without any 8-bar introduction. A perfect, vibrato-free E-flat. In unison, Maurice experienced the same tightening flesh in the softer regions of his torso. Before the curtains opened, impatient anticipation. When they closed, a void. The Chez was crowded. Voices babbled. His knew the only reason for being there, sitting at this table, drinking a whiskey, unique in itself, was to get another glimpse of, and to hear, Shelia South. Ridiculous. His carefully controlled and delineated life intruded upon this purveyor of tawdry songs. He would have never believed it of himself. Perhaps he should go and see a doctor. There again, he could ask the waiter. If Miss, he assumed she would use this title, Miss Shelia South, would be so kind as to permit him to buy her a drink. Sitting within a noise-suppressing bubble of his own construction, he suddenly thought about the film, The Blue Angel. Peering up into the far corner of the club, his eyes fixed high above the band, the hazy darkness almost persuaded him that he could see, sitting alone, in a private box, the bearded professor, spiraling towards inevitable degradation, totally entranced and helpless, looking down at his nemesis, the black-stockinged, bowler-hatted, Weimar, peroxide blonde, casually pouring out melodic titillation. "Waiter." "Yes, sir. Can I get you something?" "I was wondering. I enjoyed her performance so much. Would Miss Shelia South allow me to buy her a drink?" "I regret to say, sir, that it is unlikely. House rule. The artists only accept hospitality from clients who are known to them personally." The rebuff was what he had expected. Paying his bill for the whiskey, he left the Chez, nodded in the direction of the doorman, early start in the morning, and then walked rapidly down Back Cannon Street to find a taxi. The town hall clock struck the hours regularly, before sleep eventually prevented the formation of more creases and rills in the bed linen. His dreams overflowed with a gold and silver lame tendrils. "It's 2:45. There's no one in the place 'cept you and me. So set 'em up, Joe. I got a little story I think you oughta know." In the morning he would take the train and travel back to that safe, familiar environment where he lived and worked. He felt he needed to explain this to Dave the doorman, saying nothing about the safe and familiar, only the destination. Dave the doorman, because of his occupation, and being not an unintelligent individual, was an acute observer of the genus man. This is an essential item in the toolbox of Dave and other members of the same calling. The requirement to judge, with a glance, and predict the likely behavior of the clients who passed through his door. Dave was a filter that separated out the predictively disruptive. Maurice, however, was, for him, something of a puzzle. He was presentable enough, Dave did not detect any trace of an obsession. Maurice, impatient at having to sit through the overly long nightly preamble before the appearance of Shelia South, ordered a second glass of whiskey. Recommended by the waiter, his imprimatur influenced by both taste and cost, Maurice sipped the unfamiliar liquid, golden peaty drops rolled on his tongue. The moment arrived. Shelia South sitting on her customary high stool, this evening dressed in green lame, blonde hair piled up, extenuated her face and neck. The parted lips, a glint of fine white teeth. Flesh on flesh at that moment for Maurice seemed the most desirable activity he could possibly wish for. Hot and messy, banishing the hygienic bottle to the cupboard where it should belong. During the pause between the end of the second song and the start of the third and final rendition, the waiter slipped across and whispered confidentially in his ear, "Yesterday evening, I mentioned to Miss South about your kind invitation to buy her a drink. She will be more than happy to accept one from you this evening. I will come back when she comes off stage." Maurice sat ecstatic and entranced, the vision of Miss Shelia South, her voice, her body, her everything, the possibilities. His body transformed into a sponge, soaking up a surfeit of warm perfumed water. The concluding song. The red velvet curtains started to close. There was a problem. The curtains twitched and agitated, the unseen operative making increasingly futile attempts to make them smoothly close. It was apparent that this was not going to happen. Some malfunction in the hooks and rails. Shelia South looked distinctly uncomfortable and gave the concealed string puller increasingly desperate glances. It became obvious that this evening she would have to exit the stage, not behind the anonymity of the screening red velvet, but in open view of the public. Slowly, hesitantly, Miss Shelia South got down from her high stool. Her green sequined heels touched the floor of the podium. Maurice choked on his whiskey. He saw now the reason of the customary routine of opening and closing of the red velvet curtains at the beginning and end of her act. Miss Shelia South was lame. His obsession fractured and scattered, a precious Wedgwood vase falling to its destruction on a marble floor. His life bounded by literature invoked a vision of Leopold Bloom hiding behind a wall above the beach watching he crippled Gertie McDowell limping off across the sands to join her friends. He stood up, looked down, engaged in no eye contact with the waiter, paid his bill, collected his overcoat, rapidly left the Chez Joey, with only a sidelong nod towards Dave, and hurried off down back Cannon Street. It was late. There were no taxis to be found and hailed. He pointed himself in the direction of the hotel, thrusting his hands deep into his overcoat pockets, recalled the words written by Franz Kafka in his travel diary, describing the aftermath of a visit to a Paris brothel. Lonely, long, absurd walk home. Gone with the wind. Just like a leaf that has blown away. Gone with the wind. My romance has flown away. If you liked Shelia South and would like to be notified about future videos, please hit the subscribe and like buttons.